Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lisa Marginelli. I'm the editor-in-chief of Issues in Science and Technology, which is a journal that is a partnership between the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and Arizona State University. Today's discussion is being hosted by Issues along with ASU's CSPO, which is the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes. I am really happy to introduce today's discussion. How do we build infrastructure for a future we can't see? Before I introduce the moderator, I want to say a little bit about our general goal for these events. In part, we're here because we want to bring really interesting people with expertise in specialized topics to reflect on the way that science, technology, policy, and society interact in the real world. But such discussion requires not only experts, but lots of other people, aka society, and that means you. In other words, everybody here on Zoom is an important part of this conversation, a vital part. So about half of today's event will be a moderated discussion between the panelists, and the other half will be the panel engaging with the questions that you ask and the issues that you feel are interesting and important. To enter your questions, use the Q&A function. Now, you can use the chat function to chat amongst yourselves, but please use the Q&A to communicate with the moderator. That's where he can see what your questions are. Let's get started. Our moderator today is Paul Mackey. He's a longtime connector and convener of all things infrastructure in his position at the Transportation Research Board of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. He is also the co-host of TRB's Transportation Explorers podcast. Welcome, Paul. I'll turn it over to Paul to get this underway. Thanks very much. We really look forward to this event.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you and with the excellent panel that is here to discuss and just have a lively conversation about the infrastructure of tomorrow that we are facing. So let's dig right into it. Right now, I'm going to just quickly announce the three people we have with us today. Tierra Bills is Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Wayne State University. Hi, Tierra. Mikhail Chester is Associate Professor of Civil, Environmental, and Sustainable Engineering at Arizona State University. That must be ASU behind you. You have a wonderful office there with what a view. And then last but certainly not least, we have Guru Madhavan, who is the Norman R. Augustine Senior Scholar and Senior Director of Programs at the National Academy of Engineering. Hi, Guru.
Good to be here, Paul.
All right, so we're going to talk about infrastructure, and a lot of people have been talking about infrastructure. It's always a joy to see infrastructure as high in the news as it has been over the past several weeks. And the Senate and Congress has been carrying this through in somewhat near record time, it seems like, towards President Biden's desk. And I think it's fair to call this infrastructure package in Washington an almost FDR New Deal-like piece of legislation. It could influence us for decades to come and carry us well into the future with how we operate and how we move around in this country. So how can we build the infrastructure for a future we don't know yet? Mikhail, let's start with you. Transportation is very different now than the rigid system we've had before, and I think you've kind of written about this in your work. What are some of the biggest things we need to think about at this juncture?
Yeah, so I mean, you use the word rigid, and I think that's a really important word, right? So in general, I would say that infrastructure are rigid. Often when we're talking about a power system, a water system, a transportation system, it's designed with principles that ensure rigidity, because rigidity has worked for a very long time, roughly about 100 years. But the world is changing fast, right? It's changing fast in a number of different ways in terms of the technologies that are, whether it's on the road or what we're consuming, what we want infrastructure to do for us, climate change, sustainability, resilience, those sorts of concepts, cyber warfare, cyber attacks, right? Integrating new cyber technologies into legacy systems. All of these things seem to be accelerating, or at least unfolding concurrently. And infrastructure seem to be not able to keep up. They seem to be at a disadvantage. So I would refer to this as a decoupling. When it comes to transportation specifically, you are seeing, the emergence of, let's say, ride sharing, technologies that are steering demand in new ways, apps, for example, that tell people, when to go to a bus or quicker ways to do things, or how to delay a trip. We're seeing integration of transportation systems with energy systems, right? So what is a transportation system in 2050 if your vehicle is a battery, right? If your vehicle is charging at night and maybe pushing power out during times of instability. So, I think that we are seeing in transportation, like we are seeing in many other infrastructure systems, a rapid distribution of control of who's in charge of how services are consumed and what those services do. Case in point, for example, navigation is now in many ways done by Google and Apple Maps, right? A small change in their code base results in drastic changes to how we move about, how we consume those services. And, I think that in many ways, we're not quite ready for that. We're not quite seeing that picture. We're operating as if modernization is perpetuating the old models, is sort of revitalizing or maybe slightly modernizing what we have already. But I think we need to take a very different perspective and think about a system that's likely to do very different things and be something very different in the future.
That sets the scene really nicely for us, Mikhail. Tiara, now, Mikhail sort of mentioned infrastructure and climate change, two topics really high on everyone's radar these days and with current events. Another issue that's been really high ever since George Floyd. You've done years of work, long before George Floyd, and the recent uptick in focus, I think you could say, on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So you've done years of work on this and how infrastructure influences equity and how we can better embed equity into our transportation operations. What do you think are the most critical aspects of infrastructure for the future with that in mind?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think to try and follow up on some of the comments by Mikhail, I think that when we think about infrastructure and infrastructure investment for the future, it's important to try and learn some lessons from investments in the past. There's a wealth of study that has happened around the investment in the interstate highway system, and how when these dollars flowed, although the intent was to revolutionize transportation, there were lots of challenges with regard to impacts on the most vulnerable communities in society. And so there's a lot of lessons that we can learn about how when Congress turns on the faucet and the dollars start flowing, we need to be careful about, one, who's going to benefit from those dollars. I know that there are going to be benefits in terms of creation of jobs, as well as who benefits from the improvements of infrastructure. We want there to be a universal benefit, but we also want to be careful to make sure that those benefits are also distributed to those who are most vulnerable, those who are most disadvantaged. And so looking towards the future, there's a lot that we can learn about impacts to these vulnerable communities that has happened in the past. There's a lot that we can learn with regard to the new data that are coming online about how people move, how people interact with the transportation system. I work a lot and think a lot about how we can fuse new data sources with traditional data sources on travel behavior to sort of make the best of both worlds and expand our understanding of how people are impacted by the transportation system, as well as to retain the richness of traditional data sets with regard to social demographics and purposes for travel and how we chain trips together and things like that. So I live in this space where we need to be trying to take the best of the information that we have available to us, also leverage emerging data and emerging understandings about transportation equity, how vulnerable communities are impacted, so that we can be better prepared when, like I said, the faucet of funds begins to flow. We can have a better understanding of what the impacts of those dollars are going to be. And then we can also build more accountability in making sure that our objectives around environmental justice are actually met.
Great. Well, I think what both of you have said sort of sets up my question for Guru quite nicely. And Guru, you've worked across different areas, and you've written about how the most useful innovations are often not the ones that everyone's been talking about. So I guess for starters, do you agree with what Mikhail and Tiara have said? Are we missing some things as well, though?
Yeah, we certainly are missing a few things, and I wholeheartedly agree with what Mikhail and Tiara said, especially Tiara's important point. If we are going to actively work toward integrating social justice and equity considerations in engineering design, if that is our stated cultural responsibility, accountable cultural responsibility, to paraphrase Tiara's, then reducing waste as we conduct these activities going forward is also an equally important cultural responsibility. What do I mean by that? We have had at least a century or slightly more than experience in terms of building large-scale systems, to the point that what we might call accidents of overbuilding is really confronting us. And if you look at the early 19th, if you look at the 19th century and early 20th century, see how the United States expanded its rail networks. They proactively overlaid extended rail tracks that eventually had some waste implications. And of course, that meant more maintenance opportunities, challenges, and which of course also connects to cost implications that we're talking about. But time is money, we all know that. And the recent developments in infrastructure policies have highlighted the fact that it is not just a technical issue, but as we have all, or at least the attendees in this program, have long realized that it is as much a social issue. But I think that over time, it has decoupled, and now we are trying to reintegrate those parameters. And that's going to be a significant problem. I'll give you a couple examples. I talked about the accident of overbuilding, and that's mainly because the systems that we are constructing that in turn require extensive maintenance and long-term care. If you even look at the skyscraper business, the average height of the buildings have grown up like 160% in the past 8 decades or so. Back in the 1930s, Chrysler building was like the tallest at 319 meters. But now the Burj Khalifa is like 830 meters. And even if you look at the bridge spans, on average, they have been lengthening. And if you even look at a specific time period in which Microsoft Office Suite was being developed, the codes, the line of code went up like 16-fold or something. Like it used to be in the millions, now it's in 800 millions or something like that. So there is this active addition that's going on in the process, and that has basically given us an important challenge, because now we take on these mega projects, and we will take on such a mega project with the fresh infusion of investments. And with the experiences that we have gained over the past several decades in terms of accretion of waste and the legal bureaucracies, what are we going to do differently going forward, which is as important a cultural responsibility as proactively bringing in cultural equity considerations.
That's great. So it sounds like that's almost a vision of how we could have it all. We could build an infrastructure that's equitable and fights climate change and stays in good repair for a long time. I think of Curitiba, Brazil, where there's a line, a transit line, and then there's skyscrapers up the whole way of the line, beautiful different colored buildings and everything. That's kind of for a long time been almost a perfect vision. Is that something that we can get to, that places around the world can get to? This sort of vision that the three of you, when you put all three of your comments together, it almost sounds like that vision of the future, the infrastructure of the future. What do you think, Tiara?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it certainly is achievable, and my sense is that we know a lot about how land use and transportation are connected. If we invest in transportation, there's going to be a related sort of change in the value of land. In many countries, I think that's the example that you're referring to, where there is collaboration between land development and transportation investment, where there is an attempt to capture value associated with investing in transit. There is an attempt to couple certain types of development near transit, mixed use housing, retail, and so on. And so I think that, you pointed to an example that's very much achievable. It's not something that we see happening so much, but we have these sort of available levers that I think that they paint the picture of what could be here in the United States as well. If we are, when we're planning, if we're actively thinking about how these different dynamics are coupled together, trying to capitalize on them for the benefit of all, but also for the benefit of for disadvantaged communities.
Does some of that resonate for you, or do you think of it differently? Let's go first to Mikhail and then Guru.
No, I agree. I think the way that I think about it is, what's the challenge that we're trying to solve, right? And does the Curitiba-like transit system, for example, and corresponding land use map to that solution, right? And if the answer is yes, then the next question is, well, what is the pathway to get there? And I think we often, particularly as academics, or those in the academic world, but even so many of the rest of us forget that there are a number of barriers to achieving these solutions. And the real challenge is addressing those barriers. And those barriers are rooted in, as a bunch of us have already pointed out, 100 years of doing things and thinking about things in particular ways, of financing being structured in certain ways, of politics, pushing things one way or the other, and so on, right? And those are the real underlying currents that are driving change, or the inability to change, right? And these currents seem to be in some ways becoming tough, be tougher and tougher and tougher, right? So, you look at, for example, the trend of ideological polarization. So, if we come to a city now and we say, look, a Curitiba-like system would be fantastic. Well, you now have to deal with a new dynamic that has emerged, which is, a bunch of proponents are going to show up because they've been part of a Facebook or social media group that has filtered information in a very particular way that gives them the arguments to advocate for it. And then another group is going to argue against it because they're part of another Facebook group that has filtered information in another particular way. The brutal reality is we don't have any training to deal with that, right? The people in the infrastructure world generally don't have any training to deal with that, right? Deploying infrastructure, designing infrastructure, that's the easy part in many ways. It's everything you have to do to get there. And I think that's going to require a radical new skill set that we as a community need to think about, right? And it's not just going to be around issues like climate and politics and equity. I think it's going to be also, this realm of cybersecurity, cyber warfare, asymmetric warfare, the reality that infrastructure are now battlefields. And we are in many ways not securing them as we deploy newfangled technologies on top of legacy technologies.
I just want to say, I think it's a great point. So much of what we're talking about in terms of solutions really lies outside of the realm of engineering and design. So
I'll build on that point. Mikhail made a very important point. It's not about our confidence in deploying new and innovative technologies. Now, we have enormous capabilities through digital maintenance regimes that don't even require people, okay? And those are all happened just in the past few years. For example, the German power grid, and I'm a systems engineer by background, and we're taught to think in terms of a system's availability, that is the ability to provide service, and reliability, with what degree of confidence it can provide service. So the German power grid has reached a reliability level at 99.9997%. And that was like a couple of years ago. And if you look at telecommunications companies at large, the system availability, and anyone who uses a cell phone can figure this out, and the system availability is 99.999%. So these have all been achievements of just the past few years. And now even wind turbines reach close to like 97% availability and so forth. The point that I'm making here is like we have all these innovative approaches to conduct maintenance with or without human beings. Now, how do you deal with the business of doing maintenance, which is, I think, something Mikhail alluded to. There was a big project that was happening in New York, the Bayonne Bridge, happened over a number of years. And the basic project was to raise the bridge by about 200 feet or something like that, because post Panama Canal expansion, they were expecting higher traffic. So cargo ships had to go through that, and the altitude was just not available for them. So engineers, policymakers, and all the people who got busy into this, a lot of investment that went in. And it was a fast track project. And the environmental review alone at the outset took about 6 to 8 months and cost a couple $1 million. And then no clear assignment was really directed to all the participants involved. So there's a classic wicked problem scenario where it's someone else's problem. Eventually, the Bayonne Bridge elevation won a number of technical awards, and it is an astonishing engineering achievement indeed. But the implementation problems that they encountered really basically slowed down those recognitions here, to the point that some engineers at one point even thought whether lowering the water level in the tidal strait was a much better alternative than raising the bridge itself. And those are the kinds of things. So building a new bridge these days, I mean, it was about $4 billion or so, and the repair and the retrofitting is $1.3 billion that it happened with the Bayonne Bridge. And I think as a society, we try to give credit to individuals who says, I built that bridge rather than I repaired or retrofitted that bridge. So there's that identification, not an identity, an identification crisis that we have to confront as we are bringing in new technologies that we're all benefiting from, while taking it through the bureaucracy of the maintenance that we have created for ourselves.
So, You've mentioned the cost of some individual infrastructure projects. The money that is in the bill right now, actually, it sort of spreads it out over all the hard infrastructure. Arguably, we could argue for hours on whether there's enough in public transit or there's enough in bridges or whatever it is. But it does spread it out pretty evenly. Like I said earlier, it's almost New Deal in its approach and its breadth. There's also been a discussion in Congress that shed light on the very word infrastructure. Do we need a rebranding of infrastructure? There's soft infrastructure, which is going into the other budget bill in Congress, and then there's hard infrastructure, which we've traditionally defined as streets and roads and transit and things like that. Is this an important point? Do we have the wrong word we're working with? Should all the soft infrastructure really be part of the infrastructure in this new world that we live in now that we know so much more about the world that we live in now than we maybe used to at mid-century in the 1900s? Guru?
I like to, it's become so specialized, the concept and the term and the way it's used, infrastructure that is. I like to compare it to that of a much simpler word that we're all familiar with, which is an electron. As an engineer, I am less interested in understanding or going after what an electron is rather than what an electron does for us. So I'm more interested in what an infrastructure does for us than what it is. And the way I have come to formulate for myself is absence of infrastructure affects my performance, and therefore it becomes kind of an essential service. And that, of course, innately involves the human dimensions, the hardware and the software part of it that we are talking about in humanware, basically. So you connect all those three things, and that's I think we need to take a more cosmopolitan and a combined approach, as many have argued, for our own benefit here. What do you think, Mikhail?
Yeah, thanks, Guru. So following up on that, there's a rich history in the literature about the definition and the use of the word infrastructure, right? So if those who cared to debate the word would look, they would see, and in many ways that literature was drawn out in the media in various pieces across various mediums as the debate over infrastructure financing played out, right? But generally I start with the idea that infrastructure, right? And I'm a civil engineer through and through, but instead of saying civil engineer is like, instead of saying infrastructure is like, physical stuff, right? Which I think is the easy place to start. I think more practically and more usefully, you think about infrastructure as design spaces, right? Places or spaces in which we design, right? Now, the problem with that is it's a bit too broad. So, then we can zoom in on Guru's point, which is sort of where I go next. And I say, well, it is, or infrastructure are, depending on whether you prefer the singular or plural use of that word, the systems that deliver services. Well, what types of services, right? Basic services, critical services, entertainment services, right? So you can think maybe up and down Maslow's hierarchy of need, right? And you might say, well, certain infrastructure might be slotted lower or higher on Maslow's hierarchy, something along those lines. Now, I think, we don't even get that far, right? I think we often in the sort of policy debate about infrastructure fall into this sort of ideological trap of what it is we do and do not want to do, and then try to define infrastructure from that. And I think that is a lot of what we saw. Now, going forward, when I think about infrastructure, I always think about three dimensions. Right? So it's the physical assets that I think are the things that we interact with, every person on the planet on a day-to-day basis, right? It's also the governance and leadership and bureaucratic systems that manage those, right? So, to my earlier point, the actual infrastructure that we see is like the hammer at the end of the arm, right? And the arm is governance. So, all infrastructure have these various layers of governance that are directing what it is that they do and how they do it. And then thirdly is education, right? And that's not simply universities, but it's also, for example, on the job training, continuing ed, so on and so forth, which, very much conditions the mental models, the way that we think about and approach infrastructure going forward. So, I go back to the point that I made earlier. When I hear these debates about infrastructure, my first question is to take a step back and say, what is the problem that we are trying to solve, right? That we have to define infrastructure in one way versus the other, right? What is the problem? And I think the problem is, to the title of this webinar, right? What are the needs, wants, and services of, the United States, or maybe more broadly, in the next century, right? And how do we provide systems that enable that? And I think, a key to that, again, I keep coming back to this, is going to be this transition that we need to recognize that, Paul, you mentioned hard and soft. I think that's fine, but there's probably another one in here now, which is digital, right? Ones and zeros. And, we can't forget that, these technologies are rapidly integrating the legacy dumb old with the cyber new in, ways that is distributing control, governance, leadership, use in ways that we have never seen or probably will never see.
Yeah, I agree very much with Guru and Mikal. I think that we get into trouble when we try to define things in these neat little packages, and we sort of lose sight of following up on a point that Guru made. We lose sight of the service that's being provided and the need that's being met by the infrastructure. Infrastructure looks different for different needs, different circumstances. And the point that I want to offer is that the service that's being provided is going to impact people differently based on their circumstance. And so that's something that we need to be aware of. The other thing is that when we miss out on how say different types of infrastructure interact through governance, build relationships between municipalities, intersections between different types of infrastructures, water and transportation, energy and transportation, energy and water. When we miss out on how these different infrastructure are interconnected, we also we lose sight of some of the real issues. So, long story short, I think that the most important thing is to focus on the need that we are serving, which is another way of the way Mikal phrased it, thinking of the problem that we're trying to address.
All right, great. I still have one big question, but we have so many good questions in the Q&A box, which audience, if you could put your questions in the Q&A box instead of the chat, it'll be a little easier for me to juggle and moderate at the same time. But my big question, I'll save it for the end if we have time, is the infrastructure package that we see going through Congress right now enough to get us to the infrastructure of the future? But let's put that aside right now. A lot of these questions are more specific or even technical. If you can't answer, if only one of you wants to answer, that's fine. If you can't answer, we can move on. There's enough good questions here. But let's start. And sorry, audience, if I butcher your names in any way. But Lisa Randall asks, can the panel share thoughts on the public sector's role on cybersecurity and transportation infrastructure? Do we have anything there?
On the public sector's role in private security, and well, I think there's a lot to be said there. I guess the question I would have is where is that question coming from? So the challenge that I see is that in many ways, right, technology has outpaced and been integrated in ways, outpaced the legacy infrastructure, but integrated in ways that we fully don't comprehend the vulnerabilities that have been implemented, right? So the reason we've done that is because all these cyber technologies introduce wonderful new capabilities, wonderful new efficiencies that we didn't have before, right? You can monitor a light and a piece of hardware and fix it before it breaks, right? That sort of thing that we weren't able to do before, right? It might save us some money. But, with those efficiencies come these vulnerabilities. And, that gets us into the question of, who is leading the generation of knowledge of how to protect these systems, right? And, you certainly see guidance at the federal level on this, but, this is sort of a coarse guidance, right? When you get down into the ground level, how do you protect a particular asset out in the field? I mean, you need expertise that I would argue largely is, not developed or in the nascent stages of being developed. And I think, there's a lot to be learned on how to do that.
Okay, let's.
I would just offer quickly that I think one of the important roles that perhaps is not as visible at the federal or state levels are sort of barriers to implementation, and sort of understanding of what the problems are, who is being impacted by, or who are more vulnerable groups when it comes to cyber attacks. What are the sort of community and municipal level barriers to implementation of the latest technologies when it comes to cybersecurity?
AJ Batla asks, and we've been talking about this, this is really aligned with what you've already been saying, I think, but who decides what the expectations are for the infrastructure of the future, and how can a common future get defined? I guess I would add to that, is it Congress that is doing that defining and setting of expectations, or is that coming from somewhere else?
Or is it Amazon? Or is it Google? Or is it Tesla, right? So it's a great question, and I think that's part of the challenge. So I use the word distributed control or distribution of control, and I use that word intentionally, right? So infrastructure has been centralized for a century. Centralized. There's like generally a few key public agencies, let's say, or semi-public agencies that control the system in every which way. Transportation, there's many layers of governance, but right, if you look at a particular layer, you can see who's in control. But now we see Amazon doing drone delivery. Is this just newfangled drone technology to get packages to your door? Sure, but it's also infrastructure, right? Amazon is basically saying we're circumventing the roads and deploying new infrastructure for whatever reason, we may not be aware of, right? They don't have confidence in the existing network or something like that. I have a Tesla thermostat in my house, and Tesla decides when my temperature goes up or down, right? Nest, Google Nest thermostat. So it might only be a matter of time before those thermostats are coordinated in ways that, they see that my neighbor is about to throw a disco party or is throwing a disco party and is about to take down the grid. And for reliability reasons, they can adjust everybody's energy consumption in a way that maintains reliability, right? That's not too far-fetched given the direction that we're going. That seems like it might be feasible in the not too distant future. So I think the voices are numerous, and that is the challenge, right? So it's the legacy incumbent agencies and financing structures. It's the public that is increasingly polarized. And it is private companies that are increasingly stepping in. And I think that's the crux of the issue, right? We need the ability to have what's called shared dialogues, the ability. So I think Guru used the term wicked complexity. Yeah, one of the techniques for navigating wicked complexity and building consensus is, doing these sort of shared dialogue activities, basically, bringing people together and making sure that they kind of see the bigger picture, the challenges that certain people have, because I think that's going to be a key process for how we do this going forward.
I'll just add to what Mikhail has commented here. It links to the previous question as well. setting the expectation. And now that's a complex thought to even imagine, mainly because our expectations, my own personal expectations for a service, a product is shifting all the time. I'm expecting my product delivered through Prime tomorrow at 11 a.m. That's how demanding I have gotten on the system that has to work so hard to deliver a used book that I purchased for $1.39. And if that is the case, with these types of conveniences that stated in a geological sense that have abruptly emerged just over the past couple of years or something like that, how do you go about managing the expectation of when the services, the critical infrastructural services that need to deliver critical services get completed? For example, we built the Empire State Building back in the 1930s during the Great Depression, in like 400 days. 400 days. The Pentagon was completed in a year and a half. And it takes over a decade to build a county desalination plant in California. Now, the question now is like, I understand maybe we have all become innate systems thinkers, that we routinely introduce blockades in these otherwise processes. Maybe systems thinking does come with these types of time lags that we didn't anticipate further, to the point that we take 3-4 years for an environmental review initially, of course, essential. But who sets the expectation for those processes? And I think the idea here is like we've gotten so hyper specialized to the point of not recognizing the value of the other contributors, participants in the process. Most importantly, even the private sector sensibility could fruitfully feed into some of the big investments that we're making right now. Again, that's a high level thought. What do you think, Rero?
I think what comes to mind with regard to setting expectations and what's going to be this vision for the future is that industry's interpretation of the demand is a big part of what paints this picture of what the future will be. Industry comes up with innovations based on what they think is important. They develop assets, they put it out to the public if there's excitement and there's discourse, and people purchase it or talk a lot about it, then then it becomes a part of the future, if you will. And so I think that again, industry's estimation of what the demand is going to be is a big part of setting that image. And I think that the problem, there are a lot of problems with that as well, because and I'm going to put back on my transportation equity hat. I think a lot about the reality of that vision, given that there are disparities when it comes to who is represented in the data. And so I think that, while that is the way things tend to go, we need to really be careful about the level of certainty that we place on that vision. Our, collecting data about demand, what the people's activities and so forth. We do need to be careful because just because you don't observe individuals doing certain activities doesn't mean they don't want to. From a transportation perspective, just because you observe people buying cars and not biking or not walking and so forth doesn't mean that they don't want to. They're making those choices under constraints. And so we do need to be careful how we interpret the data that we're collecting to represent the vision of demand for the future.
That sounds so very true, especially coming from my perspective at the Transportation Research Board. This next question is from Andy Bachman, and I'm going to direct it at Guru because I think this might be up your alley a little bit. It's fascinating. It hits the climate change crisis, I think, squarely with transportation. He asks, how are climate physical risks being factored into infrastructure siting decisions, where we put the infrastructure? Are we thinking about climate change?
I hope so. And I think that's where, as another commenter put it, It is a term that's become so liable, I mean, and a victim of hijacking because various meanings are being attached to it. I'm very much hoping that these are the highest level cultural priorities we attach. How are the systems that we are constructing and going to be necessarily maintaining, even at a big expense, going to help address some of the long-term issues that have built up over the past several decades? If you put it for a moment, a somewhat narrow kind of a take, let's say an economist take, do pure cost benefit analysis on this one, just for the sake of argument and the conversation here. It's like the cost of not doing something or prolonging the repairs, retrofits, upgrades that any and all the systems are going to be affected by climate change is at least triple the cost of what's being passed right now. That was a $1 trillion. Well, so that's not doing anything for the next 6 years. And I think those are just purely stated in terms of the degradations and the social inefficiencies or the procedural inefficiencies and just sheer waste. How much money goes into projects for unfulfilled needs are substandard quality, basically. So with the climate type risks, so it's very difficult to put a number, and that's unfortunately continued to be our obsession. We have even tried to quantify social costs of carbon and everything. It's definitely going to be much, much bigger if we go in that route than what I just said. I very much hope so, because this is, as people have talked about, once in a generation opportunity, but if it takes a generation to implement all of these projects, then we have failed utterly in what we have set ourselves up for.
So, Paul, the place I like to start with this is, imagine, you are a person who just does not believe in climate change. It's just total made up nonsense. And you're a civil engineer or an environmental engineer. That's your profession. And you're literally designing stuff out there in the world. And there are, an army of civil and environmental engineers designing stuff that we use and rely on every day, making probably hundreds of thousands of decisions about the core systems that we use to ensure their reliability, right? If you don't believe in climate change and your job is to design, let's say, a stormwater pipe to handle a certain amount of water, you do not have the luxury of ignoring the data in front of you. You simply do not anymore, right? The data has presented itself in its ugly head, and you see that these precip events are becoming more extreme, and the way that I was designing it 15 years ago no longer works. I simply have to make it bigger, right? And I think we often disconnect the reality of these people making decisions in these broader political conversations about climate change and what it means for infrastructure. So, I think we know how to do robustness. We know how to make things bigger. But I'm concerned about climate quickly exceeding the design envelopes of what we know how to do, the technical capabilities of the system, what we can afford to do, whether or not we want this giant levee in our backyard to protect us. And that's where innovation is going to be needed. That's where we're going to have to think very differently. It's going to require very different mental models about how to approach infrastructure than the mental models that we train, teach, and use right now, which are those that are largely focused on the concept of hardening, armoring, strengthening, which is called robustness.
I would just add very quickly that we also don't have the luxury of ignoring how different types of infrastructure are connected. If you have water pumps, for example, they are triggered when water is sensed to be at a certain level to pump water out of freeways or what have you. And if you have a rain event that also knocks out the electricity, then you have pumps that are not going to be triggered, and then you have a disaster in your hands. And so at the same time, we have to be thinking horizontally about infrastructure and how different types of infrastructure are connected and important.
Well, we're a car country. We love our cars here in the United States. And how do we, as a car-centric society, Jeff Prudhomme asks, how should we plan to build sustainable infrastructure? And we all know that it's rare that getting into your car and traveling alone is the most sustainable way to protect the earth and perhaps the health of society. How do we no longer assume that it should be built, our infrastructure should be built around the automobile or on the model of individualized transportation? How can we really do that? I don't envy the three of you because these are massive questions that me and the audience are rapid firing at you, but
that's a massive question, right? Massive question that, there's a mountain of people who have studied this question for 50 years. So to try to, synthesize it coherently in 30 seconds, I don't think I would come anywhere close to doing it justice. I think there's maybe to add to it and connect it back to some of the points that have been said here. The way that I look at it is, going forward, when you are designing the transportation system of the future, presumably a sustainable and resilient transportation system, you've got to Tiara's earlier points, you've got to design it concurrently with the emerging integrated challenges that you are also having to face, right? So climate, obviously. So, for example, we did a study a few years ago that showed you just can't evacuate everybody out of the state of Florida if they were all driving electric vehicles today during a hurricane. You can't do it, right? And it might be unsurprising, but it screams that, this is an integrated transportation, EV power systems problem. So I think that there is a systemic perspective, to Guru's earlier point, that's needed in how we approach this, right? How we rethink what a transportation system is going to be fundamentally differently than how we've been thinking in the past. Paul, earlier you asked about Curitiba-like system in the United States. I don't know if we want to do that, right? The Curitiba solution of whatever year that was, 1990, may not be the right solution for 2050 in the United States. And it may be the solution for St. Louis, but not for Phoenix, right? Who knows, right? We got to think across those spectrum.
Okay, I think we've got to start to wrap it up. So I'm going to go back to, there's so many other good questions here that it's difficult to do them so quickly, but I'm going to go back to the other question that brings us back a little bit to where we started this whole conversation. The infrastructure package that's making its way through Congress. It's got $110 billion for roads and bridges, $73 billion for the electric grid and power, $66 billion for passenger and freight rail, $65 billion for broadband investments. The list goes on and on. Which is a good thing that it's an extensive list. How much do we actually get closer to this infrastructure of tomorrow that we're talking about with this one package and perhaps some of the budget package that's also making its way through Congress? I'm going to give you, how about each of you get a 30 to 60 seconds?
So it depends. Depends how it's used, of course, right? So if we take the perspective and if the funds are funneled into the constraints of the existing models of doing infrastructure that emerged, with the railroads of, the late 1800s, early 1900s, then I don't think we're going to get very far. But if there are significant incentives in there to innovate, to think about the possibility of collapse, right? The possibility of dealing with the idea that infrastructure as we do it today might be obsolete, might be insufficient writ large, and a different way of doing it, of delivering that service or a different service in the next 100 years is warranted, then I think we're starting to move along the right track, right? I think we need to start rethinking the ways in which we prioritize how we are doing infrastructure. The rules, the norms, the goals, the levers, the benefits, and the impacts, right? And I think that innovation is really difficult to build into a bill that was in many ways chipped away at, and from my understanding, largely focused on kind of in many ways repairing things that have been in disrepair for a long time.
I'll build on it based on a historical example, maybe a set of experiences that we have. If you look at how the US domestic airlines have evolved, the industry as such, between 1930s and 1960s, and historian David Edgerton has written about this. For every 2 crew members, there was a ground-based mechanic at one point. That was to acknowledge the fact that these critical systems require periodic maintenance so that they do the job that they're supposed to do. And of course, as Mikhail was talking about the novelties and the newness and the innovation that parallelly went beyond, and and quickly the piston-based engines became other forms. And how did you go about jet engines? That is, that meant the maintenance needs evolved as the new technologies came in, and this was especially felt in the military service. And the concept of time between overhaul, right? I mean, it used to be like maybe tens of hours, but in recent decades they've been like 50,000 hours or something like that. So the awareness of maintenance and the shifting needs of maintenance has concomitantly evolved along with the new technologies. But the point, I mean, no matter how much money we're talking about, let's say for sake of provocation, we've decided to allocate $10 trillion so through some miraculous means into infrastructure. Doesn't matter if we're going to overemphasize only the new technologies and not accidentally devalue the essential maintenance that is equally or more effective an enabler of new technologies than innovation itself. So I think that is the kind of the higher level perspective. It's more than money. It's just a fundamental appreciation that the infrastructure is no longer just a technical a project that we are creating for ourselves, but of course, as is obvious to this crowd, as much a social and legal and the political matter. So I think as long as we don't overemphasize the creation of new systems over the essential, diligent, dull systems that we all rely upon, I think that's going to be very important as we try to refine our investments going forward.
I would add that in terms of whether the current infrastructure bill is enough, I think that the way I think about this is that funding that comes from the federal government should really be the catalyst for investment. It should be sort of like, dropping a ball at the top of a mountain, and it should continue to build momentum, and we should see additional investment from other parts of society. I think that it sets the vision for what is going to be a good direction, and from that perspective, I think that it's a good start. I'll also take this opportunity to comment on sort of the environmental justice goals that are coming out from the office of the White House and from various executive orders. I think that this infrastructure bill is really making an important statement of the importance of thinking about environmental justice as we spend these federal dollars, bringing back to mind, again, some of those historical examples of what can happen when we ignore how infrastructure impacts vulnerable communities. And so I think that it's a really important step in the right direction when we talk about things like the Justice 40 initiative. But I do think that we have our work cut out for us because just very briefly, I think that we need to make sure that the vision matches as well as possible with the outcomes, and making sure there is accountability, making sure that that communities have the resources to ensure that the dollars are spent in alignment with what the vision is, which is making sure that vulnerable communities are benefited with regard to the investments, but also are able to benefit from the immense job creation that will be triggered by this infrastructure bill.
Thank you so much. I think that's a nice, hopeful note with so much to worry about on our plates these days. To end on a hopeful note of the infrastructure bill is a start, is a building point, and we are still young as a species, if you will, and learning. So I think that's nice to go out on that hope. I think we are out of time for today. So we want to thank everybody who was here attending, and we hope you got some value out of it and enjoyed the show. And thank you to the sponsors of this webinar, and Tiara, Mikhail, and Guru. You were wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Paul, Tiara, Guru, and Mikhail. That was really fabulous. And thank you also to those of you in the audience for coming. That was such an interesting conversation because you realize that we're perched on this moment between being heavily influenced by the infrastructure of the past, decisions that were made in the 1950s and the 1920s and the 1900s. And at the same time, maybe our power companies are preparing to penalize us for our neighbors having a disco party in ways that we cannot, we're in one infrastructure and we can't quite see the other, but we know it's coming. There are all these sorts of tensions and complexity and multiple visions of the future and no easy resolutions. I absolutely love the idea of the Bayonne Bridge being rebuilt at 200 feet higher and the engineers stopping and wondering if it might be easier to lower the water. That tells you how hard it is to achieve the sort of consensus. If you love this kind of conversation, I just want to say that you've come to the right place. You can read more of our work at Issues in Science and Technology. That's www.issues.org. You can also sign up for our newsletter to hear more about other discussions and events. On September 15th, we're doing an event on how can you make a policy idea go viral. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Paul for leading this fabulous discussion. We'll see you next time and have a lovely afternoon.